Hi guys, welcome back to TOK Today. My holiday reading this year was this book, Upheaval, How Nations Cope with Crisis and Change by Jared Diamond. Now you may know Jared Diamond. He's the guy who wrote Guns, Germs and Steel. It's a very popular TOK book that lots and lots of teachers, students, interested people have written, and it's an excellent book. This is his second follow-up book, Upheaval. Now, I'm not going to go into his findings and what he actually says about how nations cope with crisis and change. That's not really TOK. That's history or global politics. But this book is really interesting for us to understand how historical knowledge is made and how conclusions are reached when we're making historical knowledge. Let me just put the book down. Historians have some key questions to answer. First of all is the idea of can you establish history which is both valid and reliable? Valid means that it's an accurate description or explanation of that particular moment or that particular event or that particular sort of time in history. And reliable means, are the conclusions that we can draw from that historical event, do they apply in other situations? So what we find out about this event, does it apply in this event, and lots of other events? I often read in students' TOK essays, and they say the function of history is so that we can learn from it so that we don't repeat the same mistakes in the future. Now, whether that actually is the function of history is immaterial for this video. But what that supposes is the things that we learned from an earlier period, we could also apply in other periods. So that would mean that history has to be valid and reliable. Back to this book and Mr. Jared Diamond. He is a really, really intelligent man, really interesting man, and a superb writer. I recommend the book, and I recommend Guns, Germs and Steel if you haven't already read that book as well. Just to tell you a bit about Jared Diamond, he is a professor at UCLA in America, and he trained as a biologist, as a physician, a medical biologist, a biochemist or something like that. So his initial training was in AOK Natural Sciences. However, now he's moved more into social sciences, human sciences, and history in sort of explaining and describing human behaviour. And the prologue of this book is really interesting for TOK students because he writes about his methodology on how he constructed this book. So he writes about how he constructed historical knowledge for this book, and that's in the prologue. And he starts off by saying that ideally he would use quantitative methods. He would use quantitative methods to establish cause and effects. And that means he would build mathematical models, statistical models that he would pump lots of data into, and that data would give him mathematical and statistical outcomes. Those outcomes tend to be highly reliable and sometimes valid and sometimes less valid. And generally, most TOK students that I come across and most people in the world prefer statistical outcomes. If you're getting on a plane and you say, is this plane safe? If someone says it's safe most of the time, well, you want to know, what does most mean? What's the danger to me? And the best answer the one which would satisfy you the most is a statistical answer. So if we said, well, it's safe 50% of the time, or 51% of the time, 49% of the time it's not safe, then you're probably not going to get on the plane. But if they say, well, in testing it's safe 99.975% of the time, then you're probably going to get on the plane with a little knot in your stomach. We like statistics. We like what people say are scientific facts. That's a scientific fact. Back to history and back to this book. How do we prove in history scientific facts? How can we get to conclusive causal facts in history? He talks about, I would like to have used quantitative methodologies for this book, but then he says, that's really, really difficult when you're answering the question, how do nations cope with crisis and change? And it's really difficult because there are so many different nations that you could consider, and there are so many instances that you could consider. How do you even build a representative sample of nations and the crises and changes that they've gone through? It's very, very difficult. We think about, 250,000 years of human sort of existence. How do we choose particular times to test? And then the next problem that historians have, which scientists don't have, is scientists don't have to the same degree, is how do we establish the variables inside those instances of crisis and change that we are going to test, and then hold some of them constant and manipulate others, the independent variable, to see the effect on the dependent variable, i.e. coping with crisis and change. But even that's really, really difficult, isn't it? Because it's all happened before, and this is the third problem that historians have, which makes history such a more challenging area to produce knowledge in than natural sciences, is that you can't really manipulate variables in any controlled way in history. You are relying upon secondary evidence. You're relying upon secondary data. You can't get the French Revolution into your science lab and say, right, let's make the royals Democrats now and see what happens. Let's empower the black Jacobins and see what happens. You can't do these things like scientists can do. History is a much more challenging pursuit. And Professor Jared Diamond writes about that in the prologue of this book. So what he says he has decided to do is he chooses just seven countries and looks at particular instances of crisis and change in those 7 countries. And how does he choose those 7 countries? He chooses countries that he's lived in and that he has a lot of experience with. He's lived in 5 or 6 of the 7 countries, and he also speaks the language of most of those 7 countries. So what he's saying is that he's chosen countries that he has a deep knowledge of. And having deep knowledge of something, accurate knowledge of something, is what we would call validity. So in the prologue of this book, he's saying that he is establishing reliability through the use of validity. And that's really interesting for people when they're writing about AOK history. So if you are discussing AOK history in your TOK exhibition or your TOK essay, probably more in the TOK essay this would apply to, and you're wrangling with that idea of how historians establish reliability when they're discussing cause and effect, well, here's a real life situation that you could cite. Jared Diamond's book, Upheaval, How Nations Cope with Crisis and Change. He takes the 7 instances, or the 7 countries and their instances of crisis and change, and he looks at the vast range of variables which affect those crises and changes. Just off the top of my head, some of those variables include pre-existing conditions, changes in the global conditions, in global dynamics, changes in the geopolitics globally, the historical cultural antecedents, the historical cultural context is a good word, the global historical context of those nations, the individual actors at their moments of crises and change, the aims of those actors, and so on and so on. There are just so many variables involved, and they're different for each nation, and they're different in each instance of crisis and change in that nation. I'm like hugging the book. That's how good it was. I'm hugging it. Put it down. So when you start to put all of those variables together, what I think the book shows is that you can establish a high level of validity from one commentator's perspective, even though they're drawing upon loads and loads of different bits of evidence to build this highly valid picture, which then we hope is reliable, but maybe it's only reliable for that nation and in that instance. It's very difficult to generalize. Okay. I hope that that's given you some ideas if you're writing about AOK history and the establishing of validity and reliability in historiography, and the difference between a narrative historical explanation and a statistical or methodological historical explanation, like you would get in economic history. If you found that useful, I'd be super happy if you would give me a like or a comment or even a subscribe. If you want to know more or you want more help with TOK exhibition or TOK essay, then head over to toktoday.com. We have loads of resources there. For the exhibition, we have exemplar exhibitions that have been done. We've got how to do your TOK exhibition. We've got explanations of the prompt. For the TOK essay, we have recently published a video series on how to do the TOK essay. And we've got lots of notes that you can get, and the biggest mistakes in the TOK essay, and the easiest wins in the TOK essay, and so on and so on and so on. There's loads of content there. And if there isn't content that you need, then just get in touch with me, Daniel at toktoday.com. I always welcome suggestions from viewers on how to improve the site, improve the resources, and to produce new resources. All I say is thank you very much for watching. I hope to see you on the next one. Stay talktastic and bye.